Okay, here's what we're doing for today's class. You know the general theme for our class is 9 traits of an outwardly focused Christian. I planned a couple of Sundays during the summer where we take a slight little field trip into sort of a different topic. So today is one of those days where we're going to do a field trip. But if you remember, at the end of June, we did a class on a book called Autopsy of a Deceased Church. And it's where Thom Rainer, who's the author of the book we're going through this summer, interviewed several congregations that at one point they were really successful and they were thriving. But they eventually plateaued and then they started to decline. Eventually got so bad that they had to close their doors for good. This happens to churches actually quite a bit. Churches rarely live longer than 50, 75 years. Most of them end up closing. So he went and talked to these different churches, the former leaders, ministers, elders, ministers, whatever, to kind of find out, okay, what do you think went wrong? What was your church like? What were things like, when you were successful, and what were things like when you were in decline? So he went and he tried to find out what went wrong in several congregations that closed, and he wrote a book for churches that are still alive. And the point of the book was something like, here are the mistakes they made, and here's how you can avoid making them also. After he wrote that book, Thom Rainer went out, and he does a lot of traveling and speaking, and he's an author, and he consults at different churches. And he explained that a guy came up to him one time and said, "You wrote that book too late, because our church was already too far down that path of decline. And by the time I read it, we didn't have time to make any changes. It was too late." And so he kind of apologized, sorry that I didn't, write this in time for your particular congregation. But that the gentleman was explaining to him, it would have been really great to have a fuller picture of what churches could do now in order to change and kind of avoid that fate of having to close their doors. So that sort of inspired Thom Rainer to write another short little book. He's kind of funny. He says he writes a lot of short books because he's not smart enough to write long books. And that's, I thought was kind of a funny way of putting it. But here has another short little book. And this one, instead of Autopsy of a Deceased Church, it's Anatomy of a Revived Church. So this time, instead of going to churches that closed, he went and found churches that at one point they were really successful. They plateaued. They started to decline. But then they experienced a genuine transformation or revitalization. So instead of continuing that trend downward, they came together and said, if we don't change something soon, our church is going to be one of the ones that closes. And then someone's going to write a book about us and say, here's the mistakes they made, here's what not to do. But we don't want to do that. We want to continue to serve God and bless the community and take the gospel message into our neighborhoods. We have to do something different than what we've done before. And so they came together and they experienced this genuine sense of revival. So he went and found churches like that, and praise the Lord that there are several examples of that. There are churches that are doing this and revitalizing. So he kind of distilled the common trends that he saw in those churches down to 7 findings about congregations that avoided death. And when we talked about Autopsy of a Deceased Church at the end of June, we went over this little chart here, which just kind of illustrates the typical lifespan or life cycle of congregations, where you start young and you're kind of growing quickly, but like I said, you eventually plateau. Most churches follow this pattern. But once you get to kind of this point up here at the top, there's a decision to be made. If you do nothing and just kind of let momentum carry you along the way that most churches typically go, you'll peak and then you'll usually decline. But near the top here, if you make an intentional decision as a congregation to revitalize and to recommit to vision as opposed to just sort of maintenance mode, you do have an opportunity to revitalize, and you can kind of keep going upward again. And so that's what he was looking at, the churches that were able to do that effectively. So the book is his findings on that, and he starts with this phrase, change or die, which sounds really dramatic, and it kind of is. So in the book, he talks about an article that came out 20 years ago or something like that, and it was an article that was published, and then it was turned into a book, and it was called Change or Die. And what they did was they went and they interviewed people in the medical field. doctors, heart doctors in particular. And what they found out was that, out of the however many hundreds or thousands of patients, like heart patients, that go in and they have some sort of extremely serious heart condition or medical condition. They go into the hospital, the doctors diagnose it, they're able to save that patient's life, and then they come to the patient and say, look, your body's in really bad shape, and a lot of it is because of a diet, exercise, lifestyle choices, just where you are right now, you're in really bad shape. If you do nothing, eventually this will kill you. However, if you're able to make these changes, change your diet, start exercising more, be active, make these changes, you can be healthy, you can be thriving, you can live for many, many more years. So the doctors come and say, you can either change or die. And I don't know if doctors are really allowed to say those words out loud, but that's the message that they were giving their patients. Here's the shocking and really, really sad thing that they found. Something like 90% of the patients who got that message, change or die, were not willing to make the changes because they thought they would be too difficult and they'd have to give up too much. It was simply too much for them, too hard, too scary, too intimidating, or maybe they thought they would never actually be able to do it. The vast majority of these patients chose to die instead of making the changes that they needed in order to live. Thom Rainer starts with that story because he sees some applications to churches too. On your handout here, like near the top of it, I give a little 2-sentence summary of the book, and then there's this key principle, change or die. So on page 3 of the book, really early in the book, he says, if given a choice between life and death, most people and leaders choose death if life requires substantive changes. If you're presented with this choice, we can live or die. Living requires us to change a whole lot and to do the work and to pour a lot into this. Most people choose death, which is a really depressing thought. So the point of the book is that change is possible, life is possible, but we have to be bold enough to pursue it. In the book, he makes the leap from heart patients, physical patients, to churches that are kind of starting to realize they're in decline, and if they don't change something, their congregations are likely to close. And he makes that leap to say churches are kind of faced with the same choice. But here's a quote from the book, too. Here's the disturbing reality in all of these examples. He's talking churches and organizations now more than individual patients. He says, individuals and organizations do not lack the resources, knowledge, and information to survive. They simply do not choose to make the changes that are clear and available. When confronted with the choice to change or die, they choose to die. So that's, unfortunately, a lot of churches, a lot of organizations. It's a pretty universal principle. However, that doesn't have to be everyone's story. We always have a choice to make. The choice is ours to make, and no one forces it on us. But if we want to experience this revitalization, kind of that, if we want Southwest or whatever church if you're visiting, whatever your home church might be, if you want to avoid this sort of typical trend, then up here is where we have to say, okay, we intentionally are going to choose life. We are intentionally going to change what we need to change in order to be healthy into the future. So Thom Rainer interviewed churches that made that change, and it was hard, didn't come easy. It took a lot of effort, a lot of prayer, and he said, tell me the things that you did right that helped facilitate that change. Okay, have I been clear enough about the premise of the book and where we're going from here? All right, so we're going to talk about the 7 things that tended to be really important in these congregations that were able to revitalize. On your handout, I list each one, numbered 1 through 7. I typically have a quote from the book, from the chapter on that one, and just a couple additional thoughts as well. So you can follow along with me on that handout if you like. If you still need a handout, they're on that stool right there. The first thing that he talks about, and I don't think that these are in order of importance. I think he just did top 7 and kind of put them in an order that he thought would make sense going through the book. The first one is that they accepted responsibility. Instead of blaming anyone and everyone except themselves, they said, look, we've plateaued, we've started to decline, And instead of looking out at the world or their pastor who preached too long or their worship team that was always off key or their kids program, that instead of looking for some kind of scapegoat, they said, okay, we need to take responsibility. So instead of blaming everyone else, they took responsibility for their actions or their lack of action that contributed to their decline. On page 17 of the book, it says, dying churches blame others, revived churches accept responsibility. And so some of the common scapegoats, I just mentioned some of them in passing. Sometimes a church in decline would look out into the community and they would blame other churches for the fact that they're not growing. So they would be like, well, we're just like a regular church when down the road there's a mega church that looks like Disneyland inside, and they're practically bribing people to come, and they're watering down the gospel and making it all about convenience over there. How could we possibly grow when there's a church like that down the road? All right. So kind of blaming other churches, or if we would just change our worship style, if we would just change how we do what happens here on Sunday. I mean, they blame worship styles, other churches. They blame their ministers. They're too old. They're too young. Their jeans are too tight. They have too much hair, not enough hair. Like everything that you could think of about their minister, they'd blame them. They'd blame just the community. Like, we're preaching the real gospel, and we're preaching the truth about Jesus Christ. And the people of the world just aren't hungry for the gospel anymore. Their hearts are hard. No church could thrive in a community like this. Or changing demographics. People just are growing old, or there's too many young people moving in, or people don't value Christianity as much in this culture. So it's kind of like, instead of looking in the mirror, you look out and blame everyone else. Okay. But churches that revive were able to say, okay, we need to be honest about what we've done or what we've failed to do that has contributed to our decline. Does that make sense so far? Accept responsibility. All right. The next one is they didn't get trapped by tradition. I reused the same picture because in the autopsy of a deceased church, there was one about kind of getting stuck in the past, looking to the past. There's a big difference between having and honoring traditions versus sort of being held hostage by them. And you can look back in your own family and think of wonderful traditions that you guys do. Maybe it's around holidays like Thanksgiving or Christmas, or the way you celebrate birthdays, or just there's lots of traditions that they're fun and awesome and wonderful. And churches have traditions too. The thing with traditions is that when they get repeated for so long, people can sometimes confuse the way that you do something with sort of like the gospel truth about how it must be done. And if you have a mission as a church to go out into the community and share the gospel, loving your neighbors as yourself, the way that you accomplish the mission can sometimes be elevated to the mission itself. So if you're really passionate about knocking on people's doors with Bible tracts and sharing that, and that was effective for you 20 or 30 years ago, and then someone says, hey, I'm not sure that's the most effective way of sharing the gospel anymore, if you feel like the method is just as important as the mission, then you're going to be really offended when someone says, let's try sharing the gospel in a different way. So your attachment is not necessarily to the mission, it's to one specific way of accomplishing it. Now, in all of these churches that were able to revitalize, none of them changed the gospel message. None of them changed what they believe about the source of our salvation, the one true God of the universe. It's not the Bible or the gospel that needed to change. It was their approach to how they were able to communicate it and how they were able to take it into their communities. But sometimes we get a little bit too attached to our traditions. And instead of living with the mission as our focus, we just want to be able to maintain the particular way that we've always done it. And I think that what I appreciate about Thom Rainer in the book is that he's not against traditions. He's against traditions that get in the way of the Great Commission. So it's not that traditions are bad, it's that traditions become bad when they become more important than accomplishing the Great Commission. So the quote that I put for that chapter is, traditions are not inherently evil. And I think that's true. Where traditions become a fixation or obsession, they often become issues of idolatry. They become more important than sharing the gospel message, reaching people and serving the community, and making changes to make a difference. It is in those times churches become trapped by traditions. Constancy is perceived to be godly, and change is perceived as evil. And that's a tough spot to be in, because if you feel like the way that you've always done it is a matter of heaven and hell, or salvation and being lost, then if the way that you're doing it is actually contributing to your decline, your church is really stuck, because you feel like to change is to compromise the gospel, but what you're currently doing isn't actually working. So you kind of paint yourself into a corner there. And one of the things that could be true with churches that are in decline, if the church feels like they have finally figured out how to be the right kind of church, if they have finally restored the ideal vision of what a New Testament church is supposed to be like, if they feel like we've got it figured out and they're in decline, then someone who comes in to try and help them revitalize would say, okay, what you're currently doing isn't working. Would you be willing to consider these changes to the way you're doing ministry so that you can build better bridges with your community and focus more on serving them? That church would probably say, well, no, we're not willing to change anything because we've got it figured out. We finally got it right. If we change the way we're doing something, we're changing something that God has specifically told us to do. So every change is perceived as a right and wrong or a heaven and hell. And they would probably rather decline and close, sticking to their guns, rather than change something because they feel like they've got it figured out. There's no possible way that they could be wrong or that they could be doing something better. So sometimes churches, in their certainty over about they finally restored what church is supposed to be like, it makes them really inflexible. And so when you try and talk to them about changing something that they do, that conversation usually doesn't go well. So the book talks about some of the common traditions. What do you think some of the common traditions are that people might get a little attached to? I'm not necessarily asking you to look at the page where I've listed some bullet points there. I'm just curious if anything pops into your mind. Some of the traditions that become a little too important, sacred cows in churches.
Order of service.
Okay, yeah. How many songs, and then the prayer, and then the communion, and then, what if you did communion before the sermon? Flip that. What if you did the communion after the sermon? How uncomfortable would people get? Are we even allowed to do the offering before we take communion together? How many songs could we do in a row before people were like, this is not the right church for me? Like there's not even a break to read a scripture or pray. So order of worship becomes pretty important tradition. Having a closing prayer, like we should or we shouldn't. So however you've done it, that can become an issue. It feels like if you're a congregation where you always close with a prayer, and then at the end, instead of a prayer, someone just says, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. Now go in peace with the mercy of God. It's a blessing, but we didn't say dear God, and we definitely didn't say amen at the end. So I'm not sure if that's a prayer. And if they just say, may the Lord be with you this week, thanks, church is now dismissed, then you're really thrown off because there's no closing prayer. Okay, for sure. Yeah, offering an invitation. Yeah, a church could offer an invitation every single Sunday of the year, and no one ever comes forward at all, because culturally, that just feels really awkward for a lot of people to walk up to the front of the church where everyone can see you, and you're like, everyone's going to think I'm a sinner, or I've got some terrible thing in my life, and I'm spiritually weak, and so no one wants to do that. And so maybe the minister says, hey, I'm batting 0% here. No one is coming forward ever. I'm just going to stop doing it. The first Sunday you don't do it, you're going to get 10 to 15 concerned emails saying, well, that was probably the 1 week when someone was going to come forward to be saved, and you deprived them of the opportunity. I'm speaking from experience here, not here at Southwest, but I'm speaking from experience that, offering an invitation can be an important tradition. What else?
Communion.
Mm-hmm.
And the definition of communion and how it should be done, whether it's just between you and God or if it includes the whole congregation.
Yep.
Trying something new. during that time is oftentimes not accepted very well.
Yeah. It's often the things that worked well for us in the past that become obstacles for the future. So we've probably developed a particular way of doing communion or ordering our worship services or things like that, that it was a great solution to a problem at the time. And we were enthusiastic about implementing that strategy, that change, because it's what worked. But then fast forward 10, 20, 30 years, the situation has changed, and the way the solution from yesterday almost becomes a problem for today, or it can. And if you get so fixated on what used to work for us that you're not willing to adapt it to changing circumstances, changing demographics, changing cultural context, then what worked in the past actually becomes an obstacle for the future. So, yeah, all of these are good traditions, and all of them, let's give our spiritual ancestors credit too, that they love God, and they were in the Word, and they believed they were being faithful to God. And I think they were being faithful to God in the way that they were doing it. They weren't intentionally doing anything that was wrong or inappropriate. It's this is where God was leading them at the time. And it's just a question of, is God still calling us to do it in the same way, considering how much has changed in our world? Some things never change, but the methods maybe could. Jeff?
I mean, if you think about it to a certain degree, think about how the Pharisees operated. They were the priests, the chief priests of the Jewish people. And they were so wrapped in tradition that they couldn't even see the Messiah.
Yes.
Or didn't want to acknowledge the Messiah because of sin.
Yeah, I think for them there's a lot of traditions. There's also assumptions about the role, the nature, the makeup of what the Messiah would do or be. And so when Jesus came onto the scene and didn't match their preconceived notions about what their Messiah would do or look like, it was very hard for them to accept the truth, who was literally standing in front of them saying, I am the Messiah. Those preconceived notions and assumptions were very strong. I think traditions can kind of lead us down a similar path of certainty about the way that we know God is going to act or lead us. That can create a pretty strong bias too. All right, I think we've probably covered that one in enough detail. The next one is something that this one speaks to me. They changed the scorecard of how they measured success or growth. So churches love to count things. In fact, when I was up here talking a few moments ago, I saw Al come in. And he comes around and he counts how many people are in class. That's an important metric for us because we want people to be involved in growing deeper with God, being part of a small group, some kind of smaller community. That's something that's important to each individual Christian's growth. So we like to track that because we want to know, are we helping people get plugged into smaller groups and smaller classes where they can go deeper with God? If we had 100% of our church involved in small groups or classes, that would be fantastic. If we recognized it's at 50% and it's going down, that kind of gives us some information to work with. Churches love to count things. When I was in seminary, we talked about how the traditional way that most churches count or score themselves is the ABCs of church. A stands for attendance, how many people are coming. B stands for your building. How nice is your facility? How many classrooms do you have? How updated is it? What are the pews like? What kind of carpet? The actual facility. And C is contribution or cash. How much money is coming in? And if you have a large church with a nice building and a great budget, then you are a successful church, at least according to those metrics. What a lot of these churches recognize is that it's okay to count things like that, but health, like the health of a church, goes far beyond those ABCs. It's not just how many people are showing up on a Sunday, or how nice of a building you have, or how much money you have in the bank account. There's a lot of other metrics that are really important to keep track of, like how many people are we leading to Jesus every year? How many adults are being introduced to faith for the first time and being baptized? How many of our people who show up on Sundays are currently serving in some kind of ministry or are plugged into a small group? How are we following up with the guests who show up for the first time? How many of them come back for a second time or eventually become members, active members of the church? If all you're looking at is how many people show up, how nice is your building, and how much money do you have in the bank, you're missing on a lot of important metrics that if you did keep track of those more, relevant kind of numbers, then focusing on those things would actually help you be accountable to fulfilling the Great Commission. So these churches recognize we need to make sure and count the things that really matter, not just the traditional metrics of the ABCs of church. All right, does that make sense? Okay, the next one was they committed to powerful prayer. And even if it was only a small group within the church that were like their prayer warriors, there was always, in 100% of the cases they looked at, there was at least a small group that was completely dedicated to intentional prayer. In fact, Thom Rainer says on page 59 of the book, I have yet to see a sustained church revitalization that was not undergirded by a powerful movement of prayer. Which goes in, it connects really well to today's sermon, which is the power of a praying Christian from James chapter 5, that the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Like I said, it wasn't necessarily that the entire church came together every week to pray together in one huge circle. Sometimes it was just a few small groups or a small team of prayer warriors, but devotion to prayer was always part of that revitalization. And I think that, I don't know, I can't speak for God, but I would think that God might actually withhold success from a church that failed to pray, because he wouldn't want them to think that they were able to accomplish it on their own. Kind of like there's a story in Numbers when God says, hey, Israel, I want you to go into the promised land and fight. And even though they're bigger and stronger and you feel like you're probably going to lose, I want you to go fight them because I'm going to be with you. And the Israelites said, no way, we're too afraid. We can't go fight them. We're going to lose. So God said, okay, if that's how you feel, I'm going to withdraw my blessing and my presence for you. Now you're going to have to wander around here for 40 years. And because you were so afraid of them, you're not going to even get to go into that land at all. I'm going to let your children go, but you're going to die here in the desert. And then the people of Israel said, oh, we made a mistake. We're so sorry, God. We're going to go fight them now. And God said, I'm sorry. It's too late. I have withdrawn my blessing and my presence. Don't go. Because if you go now, you're going to lose. So what did they do? They went anyway, and they got demolished by that army because God didn't go with them. I think there could be a similar thing happening where if a church refuses to devote themselves to prayer, to intentionally ask God to be the source of their success, if they just rush into, let's fix this mode, let's do the things without praying, I think God might withhold his blessing in order to remind them, you can't do anything without my strength, my presence. You can't do anything without coming to me in prayer first. Now, like I said, I can't necessarily speak for God, but to me that principle tends to make sense. And it's really striking that in 100% of the cases, the revitalization happened in conjunction with a powerful devotion to prayer. How would you grade Southwest's prayer life as a congregation? I don't know if you want to do a letter grade or a number, how many stars out of 5 or something, but what's your sense of how we're doing with prayer as a congregation? Jeff?
It ebbs and flows.
It ebbs and flows. That's probably common.
Personally, I can tell you one of the most impactful things for me at Southwest, and I've been a member since '95, was when Amy was pregnant with our boys, and many of you know my boys. They seemed destined for non-entry in this world. They had a really rough pregnancy. And the most impactful thing that still sticks to me to this day is seeing our elders come into my bedroom. My wife was on bed rest, and pray over her for them. Now, even if that prayer hadn't been successful, I mean, obviously it was, my boys were here, that still impacted me that they would take their time and they would submit to God. It's just always stuck with me. And I think that there are times as a congregation where we're really good at this. And we don't even realize that it's going on kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah.
I think there's other times where we get kind of on that cruise control. We're doing great, things are great, and then something happens and it brings us back to our knees as a congregation.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I'll shift gears here now. The next one was that if there happened to be someone in the congregation that was just sort of like a stick in the mud, someone who was a little bit toxic and dragging the church down, these churches that revitalized were able to confront and deal with those toxins effectively. Sometimes the toxic person, and there wasn't one in every church, by the way, but if there was one, it could be a toxic member, someone who goes around, they just cause problems. They seem to really thrive on causing drama for other people. Maybe it's a prideful thing. They just need to be the center of attention. They need to get their way. Maybe it's they're fearful of change and they want to maintain the status quo, so they kind of sabotage everything that gets attempted. But it could also be a toxic leader, someone who is sort of unresolved trauma from their childhood. They've got mental health things going on. They are using their ministry to medicate wounds that haven't been fully healed and worked through. So whether it's a toxic person, a toxic leader, healthy churches were able to confront those toxic people. And this is a tough dynamic because most people who are called into church leadership, like elders and ministers, they tend to be kind and caring. They love to help people. They lead with grace and mercy. They like to offer forgiveness. And so because of those things, they can really struggle to be firm and to confront toxic people effectively because they don't like conflict. They're conflict avoiders for the most part. So they really struggle to stand up to harmful people. What they tend to do is stand back and hope that person just sort of gets the message. Like, let's just be really nice to that person and hope they decide to change. And sometimes that works, but sometimes you're just saying, I'm a doormat, do whatever you want, and we won't stop you. So the churches that had toxic people, that they were healthy and that they were able to revitalize, they were able to confront those toxic people. And in the book he says, in all the revived churches with the toxic member, the renewal did not take place until the negative member departed. Easier said than done because of how hard it can be to confront difficult, toxic people. And a toxic person is not someone who disagrees with you. A toxic person is someone who is sabotaging or undermining the mission of the church. People who see things differently, who prefer different types of ministries, that doesn't make them toxic. It just makes them, they disagree with you. Truly toxic people are more sabotaging unity, making it about themselves and stopping you from doing the things that God is calling you to do. So another one would be they stopped seeking silver bullets. And I put duct tape on there because you can fix everything with duct tape. Like if we just had that, like everything. There's even a Mythbusters episode about all the cool things you can do with duct tape. It's like the one thing. If we just had that, then we would be fine. That's kind of the mentality that sometimes churches get into. We would be just a growing congregation if only we had a pastor who would go visit everyone in the hospital or conduct personal Bible studies with everyone in the neighborhood, or preach home run sermons every week, or constantly meet the needs of all of its members, and then, if we just had the right pastor. The mentality here is we are 99% of the way to being an awesome church, but there's just that one thing that's slowing us down and stopping us. So instead of accepting responsibility that maybe all of us have a lot of room to grow, it's we're basically there. It's just that pastor. If we only had a better pastor, or if we only had a little bit more money in our budget, then we'd be able to reach people for Christ. Or, if our music was just a little bit different on Sundays, if we added a guitar, then people would love Jesus. Or if we took the guitar out, people would come to the Lord. Or if we only sang modern songs, oh man, that would game changer. Or, if we would just go back to the hymns. What was wrong? There's nothing wrong with them to begin with. Why did we stop? You know what we need? People need shape notes. You know what I mean? It's you bring this one thing out and say, that's going to fix us. Or if we just moved to a different part of town, or if we had better facilities, we just had a coffee bar. If you build it, people will come, or hot yoga lounge, or dodgeball court, or pickleball. If we just had pickleball, people would come. So we like to think that we're basically good and that there's just one missing thing. If we were to add that, then we could be healthy. The reality is that all of us need to do a lot of work on our own hearts, and it's going to take everyone working together to get us to the place where we can be successful with our mission. And then the last thing, so churches that revitalize, they refuse to just look for those silver bullets. They accepted we've all got work to do. And then the last thing was that they developed this attitude about being a member of the church where every church contributes, or every member contributes. Every member serves. Every member works hard. Every member gets plugged in. They had a high expectation for their members, a robust sense of what it means to be part of this church. So instead of that country club mentality of, I show up to be served, everyone developed the attitude of, it's all hands on deck. We all need to be invested in this church and in the mission. Ultimately, Thom Rainer says, membership is about belonging and contributing. We belong to a local community of believers, and we are expected to be a contributing and serving part of that community. So, what did these churches do well? They accepted responsibility instead of passing the buck on someone else. They didn't get trapped by their traditions. They could honor the past without being beholden to it. They expanded the scorecard and started holding themselves accountable to more than just how many people are coming and how much money is being contributed. They committed to prayer. They dealt with toxins effectively, if there were any. They stopped seeking silver bullets, and they said we all have work to do. And they chose meaningful membership over country club Christianity. If you skip down to where it says the final word at the bottom right of the back of the handout. So what is the central thesis of our anatomy of revived churches? In essence, the revived churches chose to live. That choice was arduous. The choice was challenging. The choice was painstakingly slow at times. The choice was almost always painful. That choice required church members and leaders to put God and others before themselves. That choice was sacrificial. But in the final analysis, that choice was a choice of life. So it's a great picture of what churches can think about and do, attitudes they need to develop in order to revitalize. All right, that's our class for today. Thank you guys for coming. Next week, I'll be out of town, so I'm going to find a sub to come in and share about the next chapter of that book. So hopefully next week will be great in my absence. I know it will be. And then I'll see you guys back in 2 weeks. All right. Thanks.